Morris County Chamber of Commerce Summit on Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Megan Hunter. I'm the President and CEO of the Morris County Chamber and Economic Development Corporation, and I welcome you to our presentation today. At the Chamber, we continue to connect, convene, facilitate, educate, and advocate, and fulfill our mission, which is your success, virtually during this time. So thank you for joining us and spending an hour of your time with us today to hear this distinguished panel talk about this very important topic that I know affects many of our members, whether they're small firms under 10 employees or multinational organizations with many thousands of employees. We're fortunate to have ROINJ as our media partner, Tom Bergeron, moderating the discussion today. And I'd also like to thank our distinguished panelists from Bayer and Atlantic Health, who are members of our Morris Business Cabinet. So of course, we appreciate their support. And we have the Forte Foundation with us today, Anna Duarte McCarthy as well. So we're glad to have all of you with us today. And now I would like to turn it over to Tom Bergeron to introduce our panelists and also start the discussion. Tom.
Thanks, Megan. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting ROI in. For those who aren't familiar, ROINJ, we are a multimedia publication and website, ROI-NJ. We cover the business of the state. And in essence, we're a business journal and talk about government as it connects to business. That being said, let's move to the topic of the day. We've got three great guests here to talk about all issues involving diversity and inclusion. Apparently had to have an A to be invited to the panel. I've got Armond, Al, and Anna coming. So let's, I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna introduce each one. We're gonna do a start off question. And listen, this is the way it works. This is the way we like to do Q&A and webinars. I've got a list of about 25 questions here I can ask, but if you guys are joining and you guys wanna ask a question, you can go to the Q&A, to the chat box feature, put questions in there, they'll get them to me. I'd much rather ask questions from the audience than the ones that we've come up with, because we're here to serve and inform you. So I'm gonna start with Armond Kinsey, the VP and Chief Diversity Officer of Atlantic Health System, based in Morristown and serving a lot of North Jersey. Armond is charged with leading the transformational agenda to infuse diversity and inclusion throughout the organization. That sounds really important. So let's talk about it. In this role, look, he's gonna integrate all the efforts around there and making sure that everything is in line with the priorities of the organization to make sure that they're thinking through this correctly. So Armond, let me just start with you with the first question. What efforts, how are you doing to diversify clinical careers in healthcare, both for physicians and nurses, as well as all of the executives in the hospitals? A lot of people going through there. How are you working to make sure things are streamlined and smooth?
Tom, thanks. I appreciate the question. And Megan and team at Morris County Chamber of Commerce, thanks for the invitation to join. So Tom, big question, and there's a lot that we're doing around that space. Some of it is very local, and then some of it, as you can imagine, is at a more regional and national level. And there's a lot of influencers moving into the space around, what are some of the mandates and recommendations. But we're really focused on increasing minority physicians, nurses, and executives across the system. And some of that is merely result, or the circumstances of how do we recruit, how do we source, how do we do things differently, and how do we extend our reach. So the ACGME, which is the accrediting body for medical education, has put some mandates in place around what you need to do around outreach for minority physicians. So it's not just a thing that's on our agenda, it's a thing that's on a lot of people's agenda at a national level. So we created partnerships with Black Nurses Association, Hispanic Nurses Association, the National Association of Health Services Execs, which is typically managers and above in that organization, African American managers and above, which is a national organization, and they have local chapters. So we're really trying to hone in on where the talent is and how do we extend our reach. We're looking at residency programs at historically Black colleges and universities, Howard, Morehouse, Meharry. So, getting our outreach and extending our reach is going to be the key. And then how do we remove those barriers? So we're looking at identifying some clerkships, which will open the door for third-year minority students in medical school to come stay with us for a month and get a feel for what's that feel in the hospital. You know, they'll have a sponsor, they'll have a mentor. And my role in that is really just to remove the barriers. You know, if you need a stipend, we'll help you out. If you need housing for that month, we'll try to help you out. So we don't want those things to be the reason why some minorities are not looked at for some of these opportunities.
So look, this is one thing we talked about in the pre-event call. We want this conversation to be a deeper dive than just simply, hey, here's what we need to do, and here's how you can check boxes to make sure that you have 12% representation instead of 8% or 19%, or you make sure, okay, we have at least one person of color in this role or that role. What the key takeaway that we want the audience to get is why that's important. We're not just doing this to check boxes. We're doing this because it's, I'm going to stay with you because it's very timely right now. We've seen COVID-19 has not only ripped through the country, but it has very disproportionately affected people of color, Blacks, Hispanics. So talk about the idea of, you know, in your business, the idea of having more people of color in the decision-making in the treatment process who are going to bring a different level of understanding is going to make Morristown and Atlantic a better hospital, correct?
Absolutely, Tom. Two things, you said it well. We saw a disproportionate impact to Hispanic and African American communities as it relates to COVID across the country. And we saw it, of course, here in New Jersey. Two things come to mind when we think about that. Communication tools and access. So did those communities have access to timely, equitable healthcare? And were they getting the communication as timely as the rest of the country? And we do know that there was a lack in communication for some communities. Some because things weren't being translated in certain languages. You know, overall, the CDC had stuff on their website available in multi-languages, but at the local level, not all medical centers had that available. So in some communities, we saw a 3 to 4 day lag time between people understanding what was social distancing, what was hand hygiene, because it wasn't available in their preferred written and spoken language, which by law, every hospital has to capture that information. And then access, you know, there was a lot of drive-through testing sites. But what if I don't have a car? You know, what do I do in that situation? So I think we have to really hone in and pay attention to those communities that, you know, where access points is a true challenge, which, you know, one of the things we did to solve that is to increase our representation on our telehealth lines. So you might not be able to have gotten physically to our facility, but what did we do around telehealth? You saw a lot of hospitals pivot to telehealth and being able to do those virtual visits, similar to how we're on this Zoom call today. A lot of our physicians pivoted to that model.
All right, look, I'm seeing some questions pop in, which is great. We're going to get to those very quickly, so keep them coming. I'm going to transition real quick to Anna, because look, everything Armond was just talking about was since March, since April, the last 5 or 6 months. It's like all of a sudden, you know, pardon the pun, everybody sort of woke up and said, okay, we've got some issues here. Anna's been dealing with these issues for a decade, for 2 decades, maybe just a decade, we'll say. Because it looks like she's about 32 in the screen here. So let's go to Anna. She's working for the Director of Development, Corporate Partners for Forte, which is a community that's motivated to inspire women in transforming leadership in every field of business, right? So her company's based out of Texas. She's in Basking Ridge. Let's talk about what you guys are doing and what you've been doing to bring these things that are now coming to the forefront. Let's bring us up to date on what you've been doing for the last couple of years to bring more realization and recognition of this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thank you to the Morris County Chamber for having me as well. You know, it's an interesting area that Armond's really, I think, given some great illustrations around trying to create equity around when we bring and try to create talent opportunities for people who historically have been less represented, that we have to think more around how do we make that work. And I love the experience that he shared about having opportunities to, you know, provide stipends around housing or ensuring other areas, because like you said, lots of times we tried about moving the needle, but it's not just about bringing folks in, it's what's the experience, the culture, the opportunities for promotion and retention. But what we do at Forte is to try to create a strong funnel of talent starting with undergraduate women, many of whom are first-generation students. They don't have a parent or guardian who completed college. So for them, they have less awareness around career opportunities. This issue is particularly true for women of color. So we do a lot of work with the communities of color, working like Armond shared, and I'm sure Al, with historically Black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions to try to create awareness about opportunities, connect them to companies that we work with. We have a wonderful network of 50+ companies and business schools and undergraduate schools, all committed to helping women really see what they could be. And for many of them, that's a limited view because their worldview is not enhanced by having parents or others in their ecosystem who can share with them ideas, connections to move on to that next level. And then we work with early career women and also encourage women to think about and consider graduate business school, which has been a wonderful career accelerator for women to move up in through leadership ranks in companies. And so I've, as you know, been at this for a very long time. It's actually more than 2 decades. I started off working in running an equal opportunity program in academia and worked to support the students' success, many of whom were just considered to be less talented simply by their personal characteristics or their name. We then was sort of accidentally moved into working in diversity and went to work first in an investment bank and then for a long time in financial services in Citi, and was able to see sort of the continuity of the work, some of which is very familiar to the drumbeats now and some which has changed quite extensively. All though to help support helping people reach their potential, ensuring that there are no obstacles and that idea of a meritocracy is actually something that everyone is able to experience. So I'll pause there.
And I'm going to stay right with you because again, we want our listeners to get some good takeaways. So there's another great example. Hats off to your organization where you're identifying people, you're helping them get that first job, right? This is a first generation thing. But talk to some of our viewers right now about, hey, getting them in the door is one thing. Now it's how are you going to mentor? How are you going to work with those companies? Or what advice would you have for companies that say, okay, a first generation a student coming into a workplace is going to have a different background and different understanding and a lack of understanding of what the rules of the road or how they get ahead. And sometimes that makes people shy away. It's great that organizations like yours are saying, okay, let me help you take step 2, 3, and 4, not just step 1. So give some helpful hints on what companies can do to help embrace those new employees.
Yeah, and it's really important. You know, there's a ton of research that shows that when employees onboard who are less represented in an organization, the time for them to feel culturally acclimated is extensively longer than an employee who joins an organization and has others like them in the workplace. So for an employer that wants to start to really focus on diversity, it's not just hiring people, it's what is the experience like from the moment the person is an applicant. What are they reading about the company? And these individuals are very savvy consumers. They read everything on the web, they read blogs, they look to see what other alumni from their schools have said about their experience. If the student is being interviewed, who is interviewing them? Is this a person that makes them feel welcome, that is able to provide a really positive experience? Because that person is already an ambassador to the culture of the company. And then once the person joins, what is their experience like? Is the company, you know, a lot of companies, and it's terrific, have these great communications about diversity and inclusion and equity, but what is the person's experience when they come on board? What is the orientation or the onboarding experience? And then once they're there, do they feel like they're, you know, as I like the example Armond gave, which is many companies consider having buddies or mentors to help people understand sort of what's beneath the iceberg, because most companies have these employee handbooks, but what really navigating a company are these unwritten rules, and it's very difficult for people to understand them, especially if they don't have the parent, the guardian, the older sister or brother who's navigated these types of cultures and can share with them how to proceed. A great example are individuals who never had a parent graduate from college and they start interviewing. They may not know simple protocols like sending thank you emails or following up or reading about the companies before they interview, things that many of us, perhaps even on this Zoom call, are out telling our children, so those are the things that are so critical. And again, I always take companies, make sure your communication maps the experience of the employee, because they are savvy, and when they get there, they may better understand if they don't see coaching, mentoring, connections to employees that are going to help support their success. It really can be a differentiator, and they'll vote with their feet, or the ability, they won't stay. And not retaining that talent that was so important to bring in really makes it complex to then move the needle on diversifying at all levels.
I've got two phrases whenever anybody asks me about attraction, retention, and HR that I always use. One sort of old, one sort of new. The old one, which I think was great advice that someone told me, is every employee will judge the company they're working for the most on their first day on the job and their last day on the job. Those are the 2 days they're going to remember the most. And now the modern day version is, right, and I've got kids in college, so I get it. If you bring in a new employee, trust me, by noon of their first day, they have already went on their phone and told at least 24 people what their opinion of this company is. And you want to talk about attraction, right? You've done all you can to recruit this person to come in here. They're going to tell all their friends at their school, their previous job, that this place is great or this place is horrible by noon on the first day. You've got to be ready. So I think those are great points on it. All right, Al has been shaking his head. He's dying to get in here. The VP of Corporate Engagement at Bayer. And this is great. So in that job, he's responsible for planning, development, implementation of strategies for the corporate social responsibility goals in the United States for all of what they do. But Bayer is bigger than that. And this is why I love having Al on this panel, right? There's a philanthropic arm that he has control over, oversight in working with. There's Bayer in the US, there's Bayer Global, there's Bayer in Europe, there's Bayer everywhere. So Al, who joins us from St. Louis, which is perfect, I want to talk about the idea of D&I for a company that's based in US or based globally, and how those different things impact what they might do in various spots.
Great question, Tom, and thank you and Megan and Morris County Chamber for having me and representing all my Bayer colleagues around the world. So just a little bit of background on me. So I've been with Bayer for 2 years now. I am the result of the merger of Monsanto and Bayer together, and where I've spent 34 years with Monsanto. And this is actually a great time for us, because the integration of these two companies and what we're trying to do, we're right in the midst of redeveloping our D&I strategy. But the one thing that I've noticed from a company whose headquarters is based in the States and one that's based like Bayer in Germany, diversity and the definition and the elements of it and the focal point of it is what's different about it. And much of that is based on the experiences that one has lived through, right? So in the US, there's a large history around race and ethnicity and now immigration and other issues. And so the landscape of what you're trying to address is much larger from an international perspective, which tends to be much narrower. And it's not a right or wrong. It's just a matter of what is the important piece of diversity and that element that you're trying to address at that time. But the good thing about being a global company is, right, it all still has to come together. And whether you're focusing on women, that's still women globally. And whether you're focusing on immigration, nationality, it winds up being a global issue. And even race, although it may not be as prevalent and the history is not there like it is in the US, it is still relevant as a global company, because you're still doing the same thing, attracting and retaining talent. And talent across the globe comes in different hues, different backgrounds, different experiences, so it doesn't really matter. And that's one thing, that's why I say we're at an inflection point where we can develop a global approach that can then be implemented on a local basis, but the elements of it and the basis behind it is still the same.
And I think one of the parts that comes out of that you alluded to is it's a global approach. And while we're treating each individual individually, each area is going to have a different, whereas we have to understand the culture of the person, we also have to understand the culture and the historical background of the area.
Absolutely.
Done in Boston and Florida or Texas or France or Brazil, we're all different. So one size doesn't fit all. Talk about how you make sure that your global vision also has a chance to adjust to different areas.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do, right, we have not only a global strategy, but then the global strategy is pushed down to those local markets. One of the things that I've had in my 36-year career is the opportunity to travel internationally. And so if you travel to Brazil, right, and you think about a diversity from the standpoint of the US, you're going to get it wrong, because their viewpoint of diversity, and for me, it was so educational to see the different hues, the different ethnicities within one continent that had I not been able to explore that, my viewpoint of diversity and inclusion is very narrow. So being able to adapt that strategy on a local basis, but still it all adds up to the global approach that you're trying and objectives that you're trying to hit is so important. You can't take a US model and move it to Brazil and take everything there and say it's going to work. And you can't do that when you go to India, when you go to China. So you've got to adapt it, but still the tenets of a D&I strategy still holds true no matter where you go.
All right, so let's go to some questions from the I would say from the floor, but they're from the Zoom. This one can go to anybody. It's a talk about all companies' corporate social responsibility, right? That's all we hear about is corporate social responsibility. Again, we want to get past the idea of checkbox. Yeah, we did this and volunteered here and we gave money here and some of our folks showed up and we were doing this for a nonprofit. Talk about how corporate social responsibility offers a company to integrate its D&I plans into what they do going forward. I'll throw that out to anyone.
So
I'll jump in and get us.
Go ahead, Armond.
Sorry, just real quick. I think we have to have the philosophy, particularly in healthcare, that someone's health begins before they hit our ER. So what can we do to be good community stewards of the community and of our neighbors to make sure that we can help them before they come up with an ailment? So we have the data to support and to see what sections of the community have larger numbers of hypertension, diabetes, obesity. The worst thing you could do is go to your physician, they give you a prescription and they say, take this medicine after you eat a full balanced meal, but I don't have resources to get a full balanced meal, and I don't have a place to get fresh produce, et cetera. So I think, healthcare organizations there's some space there for us to fill that gap, for us to make the community partners, to connect the dots, to be good civic community stewards of resources. Tom, like you said, we can give money and we can do those things, but how do we connect the dots so that if we're giving resources to a food shelter, our goal is to make sure that we can support you in the immediate, but how do we wrap our services around you so that a year from now, you don't have to go back to that. We help you get on your feet, find a job, find housing, all those things. So that all those things support good health, mental health, physical health, spiritual health. So what can we do to wrap that around you before you show up at our ER needing other kinds of services?
I was going to say, for diversity practitioners who might be listening and or those who are involved in setting up strategy, one thing that was helpful when I was at my former company, Citi, was that when we were looking across our strategy, we tried to align foundation support to areas that we really wanted to make progress around. So as an example, around hiring talent, we had really core objectives around diversifying the applicant flow, but we also wanted to support programs such as programs at Howard University or Spelman to really support those educational institutions that were making a difference and educating young people in areas of business. I think about the focus around the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender community. It was important for us to also support workplace equity. So we supported the Human Rights Campaign and made a real commitment to that. So one area to consider is, as you look across responsibility and being a community partner of choice, how does it support the diversity objectives of the company?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, when you think about corporate social responsibility and being a good corporate citizen, everyone has to be aligned on what that means as it relates to D&I, right? Because a lot of times D&I is talked about internally, and then at the exclusion of external. So a lot of what I do is external, right? And being able to give back to that community, you have to understand the issues and problems around D&I in that space. So when Baird talks about health for all and hunger for none, right? That's focused on those who otherwise don't have access to it. And for me, like through one of our foundations, we help provide medicines to those who otherwise can't afford it, right? Through one of my foundations. Through my other foundations, we focus on food nutrition, STEM education, health and wellness, in particular cardiovascular and cancer issues. And then how do you develop a community? But our focus is on those under-resourced communities and neighborhoods, both in rural America as well as in urban America. And because if you don't address some of the systemic issues that exist, then they're going to be exacerbated as those kids try to better themselves. And so we try to make a conscious effort to help those that otherwise don't have access to resources so that we can be equitable as we start to look for talent and start to help, build talent across the board versus one particular geographic region versus the other.
All right, so what you guys can see and hear here is we got a high level of panelists. So I'm going to put these guys on the spot. This is not going to be layup questions. We want to address the tough issues here because that's the only way things are going to get solved. So I'll throw it around this question. You talk about the George Floyd moment, right? That was so symbolic and so monumental in our country. Okay, so that happens, and the four of us that I see here on the screen, we all see that. But we all react to it in a different way from our own experiences, right? And we go into the workplace the next day, and I see you, Armond, or I see you, Anna, or I see you, Al. The question that's going to come is, what is the right way to react or not to react? If you understand what I'm saying, I want to show support. I want to talk about these issues, but I don't want to offend, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. How do you bring that conversation that everybody's thinking, right? How do you bring that out and make that, it's a difficult conversation, and the hardest part often is the first word. Give some advice on how you can have that conversation in the workplace at a time when everybody is terrified of having any difficult conversation in the workplace. So I'll start with you, Armond. Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think with everybody, it was a difficult time. Plain and simple, this is what we do on a 9 to 5. And it's also what a lot of us experience after our 9 to 5. So personally, it was a challenging time, let alone coming to work and, you're trying to coach your colleagues and have those discussions. So, when things happened, I had an immediate meeting with some of our executives, Brian Granulotti, our CEO, Nikki Sumter, our SVP of HR, and we said, what do we need to do? People do want to talk about it. And how do we coach them through it or support them through it? Not that we're trying to solve their issue, not that we're trying to tell them how they should or should not feel. So we started our town forums, our listening forums, just to give people space to vent and talk. And I've asked our leaders across the system to do 3 things: listen, learn, and lean in. We don't all have the answers. We don't all know what to do or say in the moment, but also be available and give people the space. Everybody doesn't want to talk about it day 1 or day 4. So just give people space because since George Floyd, we've had other situations that, the country is dealing with since then. So when you think you're over one, you're hit with another. So some people are willing and ready to talk about it, but I think as a leader, you just need to understand that some people need space, and that conversation just may need to be delayed.
Al, you want to jump in?
I would agree with what Armond. I am not, of course, in the I&D space, but I live it. I go all the way back to Rodney King, right? And it happened then, and as Armond so eloquently put, it continues to happen. So for many of us, especially African Americans, when that happens, we live it every time. And what you have to do, as he mentioned, is you have to create a safe space where people want to talk, and you got to let them talk, right? And vice versa, people have to listen. They have, it's because if you get into a debate about it, then you're not solving anything, because the experiences of people are just so different. You know, one of the diversity awareness trainings that I took in my 36-year career it was around putting yourself in another person's moccasins. And the only way to do that is to sit across from someone to hear their story. And so creating that safe environment that Armond talked about, I think is so critical. And it's one of the things that Bear did when it happened, is we had an open forum that anyone can come in and express their opinion and talk about it. It was not about solving the issue, because this is bigger than Bear and it's bigger than anybody on this particular panel, but to raise sensitivity around it, and not just externally. And that's the thing. When this happens, it happens externally, but it tends to be focused on one element, which is criminal justice. So how do you expand that conversation to talk about other isms that are taking place that people don't talk about in the workplace for fear of retribution or being isolated and alienated? So you have to create a forum that you bring that internally as well to talk about issues. I say all the time, external is just a microcosm of internal. What's happening out there is happening inside as well. Not to that degree, but the injustices, the overlooking, the lack of promotions, all of that systemic stuff that's taking place outside happens 9 times out of 10 within corporations, and you just don't see, right, the villainous of what happened to a George Floyd taking place in corporate America, but it's still the same.
Yeah, Al, you know, I was saying to some extent, slightly differently in that the nuance I see a little different is that employees expect it to some extent to be different because of all, I call that the curriculum that's happening outside of a company. And I think back, for example, when Matthew Shepard, another, you know, terrible crime where this young man was killed and was because he was gay. And the employees, I remember at that time, wanted to feel that they worked in a place where they would be respected, they would be safe, and, you know, physically, not as you described in an interesting way, you know, have that come upon them. And that becomes a real dissonance for people, because as these companies, we all, you know, companies respect for employees, non-discrimination, that those are the credo of the company. And yet, you know, that's the anticipated contract, but that's not the employee experience, which is what you're referring to. But they expect that it's going to be better, and that creates the dissonance. You know, since the events of the last few months, and appropriately said, you know, it's a long, unfortunate set of circumstances with George Floyd being among several other tragedies. It's really personally was very challenging. A lot of conversations with friends and others. You know, we have in our team young moms of young Black sons who are trying to explain to their children what happened and how it will be hopefully different for them. So those are tough conversations to have. And then the constituency we work with, we have a lot of young, bright women who are real agents of change. They are among those that were out protesting because they felt it was critical to do so, and they had time. Many of them had some time to do it. And so we wanted to energize them, but also be hopefully beacons for how they could do this work effectively. So we provided context around advocacy and how you can become a proactive change agent, both in their own environment as they move on to business school and corporations. But I'm very troubled because I'm not sure how sustainable some of these efforts are going to be. I've been in this space for a long time, and I know that many diversity leads that have in companies that have been working at this for a very long time suddenly felt that the progress that they'd hoped had been made has not been made, and that we still have a real paucity of representation of people of color in senior roles. And so while there has been some progress made, there's a lot of work to do. And I feel like this was a real I'm a Roman Catholic, so I'll say a come to Jesus moment, but I feel like there's, however you want to describe it, but that's how it felt for many. It's like, you know what? It's reckoning. It's a reckoning with what's not happening yet and needs to happen.
So let's try to turn, and I want to give this to some real usable advice to our viewers here. When we talk about workplace conversations, let's understand that there are two workplace conversations, right? There is, on the one hand, there's a message down from the CEO, and we know what that's going to be. That's going to be a carefully scripted words. That's going to come down from somebody that in a big company that the regular employee may never interact with. And then there's going to be the message that comes from the immediate supervisor. And there's a difference in what that means to each employee when it comes from. And then and I'm going to add a second part here because I'm going to challenge you guys. There's the message that comes when you and I talk one-on-one. And then there's a message that maybe we have 8 or 10 in a conference room and we're talking about it. And that's a different conversation. So talk about the do's and don'ts of getting that message out and how it has to be different and needs to be different and impacts your employees differently depending on those scenarios. And I'll start with you, Anna.
Yeah, no, I think that the first thing that came to mind was that it's wonderful to have a strategy, but you have to have context around how will it show up, how is it measured. And so among the things that are important are to embed it in, for example, those listening into leadership standards or performance standards, like what are managers going to be responsible for? What were they going to be held accountable for? And to define that for different levels of management. And there's an opportunity then to really hold people from the board of directors, depending on what type of company, to a smaller organization. But what many people just want to know, what should I do? What am I supposed to be doing? So if this is about hiring better, more diversity, developing people equitably, retaining people, what are the objectives that can be defined for how a manager will help to do that? So I think that's really critical. And sometimes it's a lost step because someone thinks, oh, we hired a diversity head, they're going to fix all of that. They're going to make it all work. But the fact is most of the decisions are made deeper in organizations about who gets hired, who gets coached, who gets developed, what the workplace culture is like, and putting some metrics around that. A simple thing is to just add within an employee opinion survey or engagement survey some questions around diversity. Do people feel respected? Do they feel they have an equal opportunity for advancement? To what extent feel like their diverse opinions are valued and respected? Those things can be measured. They can be looked upon to see where areas or departments or functions need more focus. So those are just a couple of suggestions about taking it from a desire to make a difference to really putting some operational plan around it.
You know what, and Armond and Al, before you answer, I'm going to take this a step further because I know we all know this situation, right? Where we're in an office, we're in a company, there's 15 people, and we have a D&I initiative. So what are we going to do? We're going to find the 1 or 2 people in the room that might be a people of color. We're going to say this person's going to be in charge of it. And then every 3 months, we might have one video or one guest speaker where we come in for an hour, we talk about it, and then we go away. And it just doesn't feel like, it feels like it's checkbox D&I, like we say. Okay, well, they're going to do it. How do you make sure that, this isn't an issue that just a person of color needs to deal with? Because if it is, then we're missing the point. How do you make sure as a company that this is what Anna was just saying, this is carried over on all leaders at all fronts at all times?
Yeah. So I go back to the message, right? My experience is if any change is going to happen, it is not up at the C-suite level. It's going to be those middle managers, because those are the ones that are doing the hiring. Those are the ones that are doing the developing. And those are the ones that are in the room that are making recommendations for promotions. I think why we haven't made as many gains as we probably should have is that not everyone has bought on to why this is necessary. So we talk about the business case for diversity. I don't think we've done a great job really getting the buy-in, especially in that middle level, of why this is important. Because we try we talk about it so high and lofty, and we throw numbers out, right? I'm gonna spend $30 billion over the next 5 years, and I'm gonna increase. But why? Help people understand the need for it and why it is important. And especially in this space, and Tom and Armond, you guys hit on it early on. We have a health disparity in this country. It predominantly affects African Americans. So who's going to be buying healthcare products? Who's going to need healthcare products? So your consumer is going to need to be able to have a voice in what you do. Therefore, you're going to need people who understand that constituent in order for you to be successful. And when you look at the changing demographics of the population, the talent pool is just going to look different, right? And if you want the best, they're not going to look like they do today. So we haven't done a great job of really helping people understand why diversity is important and why we need these differences. Now, once you do that, then you have to change many of the processes that help us or stop us from achieving what you want to achieve. And here's an example. Everyone knows, for the most part, that in urban communities, education is not at the level in some of the suburban communities, some of the private institutions. I know because I'm a product of an urban school, but my kids are the product of a private institution. I see the difference in the level of education. The resources that are given to African American kids, Hispanic kids, is different. And then again, this is not I'm not trying to make a generalized statement, because there are, right, exceptions to the rule. But for the most part, the resources are different, right? So here's a real live story. This guy went to an urban school, went off to college at Michigan State University, and graduated with a degree in accounting. Along the way, he had to work every single day in order to pay for his tuition because he had no help from his family as he come up. He's the first generation kid, right? Graduated, overall GPA 2.8, 2.9. His technical GPA 3.5, but he can't get in the door to explain his story. Versus another kid who's got all the resources in the world. And by the way, that kid can drop a class when it looks like he's gonna fail it and retake it because he can afford to do it, where the other kid cannot. So how do you get that experience behind that GPA, which is what we tend to measure kids by today? How do you get all the other soft stuff that is needed? Leadership skills, initiative, proactiveness, right? That tells the story that 2.9 is really a 4.0 or a 3.5. And the skill sets that are needed, they're not measured by GPA. They measure by other things. So we need to change the recruiting and the interviewing process so that you get at that level of students, because until you get equity in the education system, it will always be tilted. So changing the process, getting the message right, getting people bought on, it goes a long way, in my opinion, of ensuring success. Otherwise, we will repeat this again.
All right, I got 2 points on that. One, my son literally called me last night and told me he had to drop a course, and this isn't the first time he's made that phone call, trust me. But secondly, this leads to a question that we got from one of the viewers, and Armond, I'll go with you on this, right? Al, those are great points, right?
Oh, by the way, that kid was me.
Yeah. So now, but listen, here's what it comes to. How do you, as an HR, as a company, as an employer, I can't go, hey, did you come from a 2-parent household? Or hey, did your mother work, or was she after school when you came home? These are questions that I'm not allowed to ask. So it's difficult for me to understand that story. So Armond, when you're on that recruiting, what are the tools to be able to get that complete picture that you want? But there's so many rules and regulations that prevent you from asking some of those questions.
Good question, Tom, and Al, thanks for that example. I think it's extremely clear cut. But I think, Tom, to your question, we have to recruit and have these conversations much differently. We by the time you get to the interview, most times we know your technical ability. Right. I need to get to know you, the person. And there's ways to have those conversations without me asking how old you are, how did you grow up, what languages do you speak? There's ways, and I think, from an HR perspective, we have to be cautious of how much of the HR responsibilities you relinquish to hiring managers who may not have been trained to do so. So they can be great, or they can get your company into trouble. So I think the HR part of it, we have to train our hiring managers to have those conversations. They're not difficult conversations. Particularly when you get new, excited candidates, they will tell you their story happily. And I think that's the ability for you to understand what somebody's skill set is, because you can have great technical abilities, but particularly in healthcare, how did you treat that patient? Were you rude to the family of that patient? Or what was your bedside manner like? So those skills are as important as your ability to do the technical side. So there's ways to have those conversations without, getting into the HR, legal trouble piece of it. But you have to be willing to want to learn and get to know the candidates, and not be so quick to judge and to just put a body in the seat and expect them not to want to learn, not to want to grow, not to want to develop.
So we just got another good question, and it segues into, I'm going to do a little promo for ROI. Our number one person on our color of influence, people of color influencers list yesterday was John Harmon, the head of the African American Chamber of Commerce. He's a fantastic leader. He hits these issues head on. And one of the things that I remember talking to John about, and we did a story on a couple months after George Floyd, was diversity fatigue, right? Okay, this happened. There's a great explosion of interest and impact. And what can we do and how can we do it? And how do you keep that momentum going? We can't go 99 miles an hour for 10 years, but we need to keep the car on the tracks, right? We need to keep the train on the tracks. We need to keep going at a steady rate. How do you keep these questions where it's top of mind, but maybe not the dominant factor? So it's something that is part of the regular thinking, and it just goes on, and we make the incremental improvements that Anna, like you're talking about, instead of going the cyclical up and down, how do we keep this a steady progression to where we want to get to?
Yeah, well, this is something, it's very real. And all of us have been in this space for a long time, is that whenever people have other issues, we're in a great example of it right now. We're in a pandemic, and there's market dislocation as a result of it. There's job loss. There are significant healthcare issues, which these gentlemen are very well informed of. And when I worked in financial services back in 2008, we went through a significant market dislocation, and it was very hard to get people to pay attention to diversity per se, but what they did care about were the business impacts. And having, I think, going back to something that Al mentioned earlier, it is a business case. And we do these things ultimately. I work at a nonprofit, but most of the organizations listening probably are for profit, and they hope to realize returns for themselves, the shareholder, for the community. And so ensuring that there is clarity around why there's a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion is really critical. And it helps to be at the table around decisions that get made when you start to look at job reduction, making sure that those things are done equitably, looking across services in the community. Why do we do these things? What are, having to cut back, but how do you do so equitably? How do you ensure you remain a partner to an organization that has need? But people, there's a lot of fatigue when people feel it's flavor of the month, or when they think it's just something that's out there that I can disregard, or, oh, it's still here on my leadership objectives, really? So there needs to be an understanding of why does the company care and do this, and that it's not, we used to call it building a bridge versus putting up a paper house. There has to be a foundation there that at the core, these are the 2 or 3 things why we focus on this. For us, it was getting the best people and making sure that it's inclusive, ensuring equitable development, ensuring retention and promotion equitably, and being that neighbor in the community and to our partners, our business suppliers. And what that looks like each year might change and has to be fluid because of the environment. But when it's viewed as just a jargon or an HR program of the month, there will, I think, ensue fatigue around it.
And a question just came in for a viewer that I think is a good one. How do you handle, I'm not going to give a percentage, but let's say there's 25% of the people who don't feel like this is an issue, or don't feel like this is important, and don't want to participate in this system, and don't value this like other people do, and don't think it's important in the workplace. What do you do to bring along other people to show that this is important to the company and is important to society more than anything?
Well, just real quick, because I tend to be one of those people that wants everyone to like me. And so I used to focus on that 25%. But the fact is that, to get efforts like culture change, because this is essentially culture change, you want to focus on the people that really trust that this is important for the organization, and that have trust in leadership, and get those advocates in those at all levels of the organization. Some of the most ardent supporters are going to be new employees, people in the middle who care deeply about these issues. They see the business opportunity to start to cultivate advocates, allies, people who care about this, to become and support that grassroots momentum. And those people can be really helpful in bringing others along. It's very hard to create an edict and said everyone will do this, because you're going to never, it's hard to bring everyone along, but being able to cultivate those, having champions. Al mentioned global organizations. It's really hard to have a look across if you sit in Manhattan or Morristown and look across the world. But if you have stakeholders and advocates in place, they can help bring others along.
All right, great point. And I'm going to answer a question that keeps coming up, because we do a lot of work with executive women in New Jersey, and talking about the importance of having women of all colors in executive positions. And there's studies all the time that shows companies that have more women on their board are far more profitable. The same holds true for companies that have more minority and diversity representation. Just to help you make those decisions, help you see problems before they happen, makes you very profitable. But here's the other point that all the time comes up with HR people on why this is important, what's the business case for it. Because I can tell you, as someone who's got 3 kids in college, who's coming out, who's gonna be starting looking for jobs, the next generation of students does not want to go to work for a company that doesn't embrace this, period. So if you think that this isn't important, that's fine, but the 22-year-old kid that you want to hire does, and they're not coming, and if they do and they find out you don't take it seriously, they're leaving, and that can be a big problem. Alan, Armond, jump in on that comment.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I'll go back to your first comment that you made around people not buying into it and people don't see it, and even the statement, which is factual, right? And I agree with Anna, by the way, that you're not going to get everybody on the boat. It's just not going to happen, which is okay, all right? Long as they're not undermining what you as a company is still trying to achieve. However, there are people who don't necessarily buy into the statement you made that greater representation up top leads to greater profits, because it's like, well, show me, I don't see it, right? And they'll give you a bunch of other examples of companies that aren't diverse, because we haven't reached that level yet, and they're successful, right? And one of the things I think that we have to figure out how to transition to, and Anna hit on it, is I think we're still, for most people, they're still in this compliant mentality. Diversity is about complying to something. So it's hard to get to the business case of why it really makes sense, especially for what you said. The next generation of talent is not going to look like us, right? They don't get that piece because they're so stuck in the now that they can't get out of that and go, I don't see it, so why should I do it? And so we got to do a better job of helping folks understand this is not just about today, it's about tomorrow, right? And until we do that, we'll be stuck in this compliant mode that, okay, I got to hire X number of African Americans, X number of Hispanics, and so that I can be diverse. Okay, and then it gets to the check the box mentality that you talked about,
100%.
right? We checked it, I interviewed it, I went to the school, I couldn't find anybody. Versus really having that conversation.
But enough about Wells Fargo.
Yeah. But having that conversation really, and buy-in to, no, we need to do this, right? And I go back, especially from a business case is always difficult. I think it's easy, and now that I'm part of a larger corporation, I'll tell you, as my son, I was just crop science and agriculture. And it always came back, well, but farmers don't look like African Americans. Farmers don't look like, so they say, I don't buy that business case because my customer doesn't look like that. Okay, I got a pharmaceutical arm now, and my consumer, at the end of the day, I tell them your consumer, no matter what, is diverse, right? It's not just the farmer, it's who's buying our products at the end. So you got to look beyond just that first element of who you interact with. It's the world, and the world is just going to be different. And so that's the hard part that I've seen in 36 years of trying to teach this and wrestle with this. I'm not as good as Anna, but you know, I did stay at a Holiday Inn, so I could do a little bit of something on diversity. But it's such a difficult nut to crack, right? And the other mistake I think people make, they try to solve it in 1 or 2 years. And so what you do is you go out and hire diversity, but you haven't fixed the culture because it's still a compliant culture internally. So you
100%.
haven't fixed the culture internally, and so they leave. So you wind up having a higher exit rate than you do a hiring rate, and you're getting worse off than what you were when you began with. So this is such a large nut, right, to crack. There's no right answer, which is why not many companies have figured it out just yet. But you got to keep getting on that horse and getting the right people in the room in order to address it.
All right, well, fortunately for us, Armond has all the answers, right? They brought him into Atlantic, and man, it's just a couple of years, he's gonna solve it. We're closing on the top of the hour, but Armond, I want to go, as you look out, right? This has been a heck of a year, right? That you just got here and all the things you face. But when you're looking at it 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, talk about the road that you want to take Atlantic.
Yeah, I think we all hit on it to some degree. Is I don't solely own the diversity inclusion strategy. We, as a leader in this company, everyone has a stake in that. And I think Anna mentioned very early on, there's a difference between diversity and inclusion. It's a reason why there's two separate words. We can get the diversity in the door, but the inclusion is around the engagement piece. So we need to make sure our leaders are engaging our diverse team members right from the start. You know, we can't discount anybody's idea. So I think the way diversity will show up at our doors will be different. I think, Tom, you mentioned, you know, that 22-year-old is looking for a great opportunity, but that statement related to what Anna said earlier, that 22-year-old is doing his or her research about the company today. So you can't wait 2 years for them to graduate and say, oh yeah, we're going to start hiring diversity at the leadership level, at the board level. They're expecting that today. So if we don't start making those changes internally, we can't expect, you know, you talk about innovation and being ahead of the market. Those things won't happen. And, you know, it's a new phenomenon for healthcare to look at their patients as consumers, but that's just what we are. I mean, we are all consumers of healthcare. and I have a decision to make whether I drive the extra 5 miles because there's a healthcare facility that I think will tend more to my needs or my language or my culture versus the one that may be the closest. So I think, all of our industries, we have some work to do to make sure that not only externally that's understood, but even our internal staff and team members feel that they can be 100% who they are, and that our leaders will support that.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. I always like to close with a lightning round, and I always like to surprise my panelists. I haven't been able to throw them all yet, but I got one good question, right? You get 25 words or less, you get 30 seconds or less. Again, we want to have a lot of takeaways for our viewers, so I'm going to come at this from a different angle. For those people out there that are thinking about, okay, I need to have impact. I need to have more D&I in my organization, large or small. I want you guys to give them one thing that they shouldn't do, right? What are the mistakes that you've seen? And they're always well-intentioned. So give me something that someone they shouldn't do, because I guarantee you someone out there is thinking, oh, I'm going to do A, and you're going to tell them, don't do A. Trust me, it doesn't work. So Anna, I'm going to go with you. Give me one thing that somebody wants to avoid that they might think is going to work, but trust me, doesn't.
Yeah, I think that the critical thing is don't think that someone else has to do it. Everyone has capability to make a difference. And whether you're a 5-person organization or 5,000 or 50,000, it starts with you. And be curious, be a good listener, understand the experiences of those around you, and ensure that you start with yourself to make other people you work with, their experience day to day, respectful, inclusive, and fulfilling.
Al?
I'll add on to that. A big thing to watch out for. I won't say don't do it, just watch out for it. Many times in most of our corporations and companies, we are underrepresented. So we tend to go to that one person who is the representation and ask them to do it. So piggybacking on what Anna does, engage them, but don't turn over the keys to that person. Involve them, because then it looks like you don't really care if you're just trying to check the box and you're turning it over to the one Hispanic you got in your organization to solve all the issues around diversity.
Armond, final word.
I agree with Anna and Al. The only other thing I would add is don't discount the data. So while you can't completely solve a problem with data, it tells a great story. But you also have to talk to your team members, your leaders, because there's a piece of the story that's not in the data. So make sure that you're getting a full and clear picture, and don't be so quick just to throw education out without understanding what impact that education would have.
Awesome. I want to thank Anna, Al, and Armond, the 3 A's. That was an A+ panel if I've ever seen it.
Thank you, Tom.
Megan, do you want to jump on here again? Are you still out there?
I just want to thank everyone for just an extraordinary discussion. I know I learned a lot, and there's a lot of key takeaways that we can apply to our own organization. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Tom, for your expert moderation.
Thanks for having us.
All good.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.